Hello everyone, welcome back to another video, and today I'll be ranking all of the pieces in chess. And I'll be ranking them based off of course, how much they're worth mathematically, and if you don't know that system, the pawn is worth 1 point, rook is worth 5, knight, bishop worth 3, queen is worth 9, but I'll also be ranking them based off of how much they impact the opening, the middle game, and last but not least, the end game, and also how many tactics that they can perform. For example, a knight can perform a fork, but it cannot perform a skewer, which is another really popular or common tactic that you must learn in order to improve at chess. So this means that I won't simply be putting the pawn in D tier just because mathematically speaking it's worth 1 point. But apart from that, let's get into the video. So of course there is 6 different pieces in chess, and I'll be starting off with the pawn first. Now, although the pawn is only mathematically worth 1 point, it is actually very beneficial to every single part of the game, because usually the opening really depends on the pawn, and whether you'll have an open game or a closed game also depends on the pawn. For example, if you pack your pawns really tightly, then you'll most likely have a closed game. But maybe if you play something like the King's Gambit and sacrifice a few pawns or open the position up, then you'll have more of a tactical and open game. So if you want, let's say for example, a closed game, then maybe you have to study the pawn structures of closed games and how pawns work, how pawns form and behave in a close position game. And usually there are like pawn chains and pawn walls that you'll have to get familiar with. And another cool thing about the pawn is that it is usually the biggest aspect that determines who will win in the endgame. Especially in professional endgames, I would see a lot of games that usually the pieces aren't the ones that are actually checkmating, but instead the pawn, because like you might know, if the pawn gets to the other side, then it can become any piece. This means that when all the other pieces are gone and the pawn still exists, then it has a chance of becoming a queen. And usually the side that has more pawns or pawn closer to the final rank will win the game, and the pawn is overall a really important instrument of the endgame. The pawn is also pretty important in the middle game, because the middle game of course transitions into the endgame. And if the pawn play is good and you have a decent pawn structure, like no pawn islands, no doubled or tripled pawns, then most likely you'll win the game in the endgame. So the pawn is a very important part of not only the opening but also the endgame and middle game. There are also cool moves that you can do with the pawn, for example promoting, which I mentioned before, and en passant, which is a widely memed move. And I think the pawn can also perform a move where it is only legal for 1 turn and then it is never legal again, and that's of course moving the pawn 2 squares up on the first move. So the pawn can also perform some tactics, for example forks, but not skewers and tactics that involve long-ranging pieces. But overall, I think the pawn actually belongs in S tier just because of how important and useful it is. Next, of course, is the rook. Now, the rook is a pretty good piece. Mathematically, it's worth 5 points. However, it is not usually used in the opening. Actually, it is, I think, the least used piece in the opening, and usually only comes out during the late middle game and end game. And even usually in the middle game, the rook still might not come out. And in the end game, the rook is pretty useful. However, it can be prone to some forkings with the knight and the bishop. And Its impact on the game isn't that great either. Like I mentioned before, the rook isn't really used in the opening and middle game. But if you open a file for the rook, it can become pretty useful. But if you're playing like a middle game with closed pawns, then the rook is pretty much useless actually. So overall, I'll place the rook in B tier. I don't think it's that trash, but it isn't too good either. And next I'll move on to the knight. Now the knight is a good piece. It's not amazing, but it's pretty good. Mathematically, it's only worth 3 points, and the reason why I say it's good is that it is very important in the opening. In fact, most of the time the knight will come out within the first 3 to 10 moves of the opening. And although you can perform tactics such as forks, the knight really isn't that mobile of a piece. Really, especially in the endgame, where usually the color with the bishop will usually dominate the color which has the knight. Now, the knight really also depends, because in a close game, the knight will show its true power, while in an open game, the knight will pretty much be reduced to absolute garbage. So I think the knight in overall goes in C tier. It's a bit worse than the bishop, which is usually, generally speaking, a bit better than the knight, despite it also worth only 3 points. However, the knight can be put into a really powerful situation if it is supported by a pawn, and usually this is called an outpost square, where a piece, or let's say a knight, a bishop, or a rook is supported by a pawn. And in this case, the knight can be worth quite a lot in relative value, but typically I don't really enjoy using the knight that much. Now the bishop is also mathematically worth only 3 points. However, it is better than the knight, especially in the endgame, where typically the board is more opened up, but in a position where the pawns are packed together and it's a close game, then the bishop is worse than the knight. However, the bishop can also be a big part of the opening game, because if you put it on a square like, I think, G2 or B2, it's called the Fianchetto Bishop. It can be really strong, laser beaming down the diagonal onto the rook and the pawns, which is a good part of the bishop. However, if you change the game into a more closed position, then the bishop just really sucks, and sometimes you can lock a bishop in jail because using a few pawns, because the bishop literally covers only 50% of the board. One color bishop only covers one color, so that is a downside. However, the bishop, I would say, is way more mobile than the knight, since it can move all the way across the board. And that is why I put the bishop in B tier. I wouldn't say it's better than a rook, since once again, mathematically speaking, the bishop is worth less than a rook. However, it can be more useful than a knight, especially in the endgame, and I would say that many professionals agree that the bishop is worth a tiny bit more than the knight. And now I will talk about the queen, and like most people know, the queen is the most powerful piece in chess. It is mathematically worth 9 points higher than every single piece, meaning that usually a rook, a knight, and a pawn together is able to draw a queen. I wouldn't say defeat, but they can draw a queen. And the queen is the best piece. I would actually put it in front of the pawn, but yeah, I would put it in front of the pawn because the queen can be useful for a lot of tactics, especially in the endgame where the queen is extremely mobile. Minor pieces and the king are extremely prone to the queen's forks, which will usually result in devastating loss of material. And the queen is also the biggest attacking piece on the board, and if you don't know, usually if you trade down the queens, the attack will kind of diminish, which can be beneficial but also not that good if you're the attacking side. The queen can also just easily dominate every single piece, and if it stands in the middle of the board, then it can be a wooden shield and see everywhere on the board. And now I'll talk about the king. The king, if you didn't know, is actually the worst piece of the game, despite it being named the king. And you'll pretty much have to spend the entire game trying to protect the king, because if your king gets checkmated, then you actually lose the game. And the king, of course, can only move one square on either side, which is pretty much a really nerfed down version of the queen. And I don't think you can actually perform any tactics with the king. And instead, well, you can do the rook, but it's the rook castle, but it's really not that good. And the king is just really a liability. You can't use it to attack. You can't really use it to defend either, so I just in general put it in D tier. And this will be it for today. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.